Good evening and welcome to the BLSI Business and Economics series. My name is Andreas Wasmuth. I'm the chair of program and also the business and economics convener. I'm delighted to have Professor Veronica Hope Hailey with us again today. She came and gave a fantastic presentation not too long ago at the BLSI in person. And regrettably, obviously, with the pandemic, this time we are limited to Zoom, but I'm really looking forward to her presentation. Before we get into things, and I'll introduce Veronica before she gives her presentation, just a bit of Zoom etiquette. Could you please remain on mute and have your camera off for the duration from now on to the end of the presentation, to the end of the Q&A? That would be much appreciated. And once the Q&A starts, there's three ways of asking a question. You can ask a question throughout the presentation by posting things in the chat room, and I'll pick this up and we'll use that as a basis for some of the questions. A second way of asking a question is by raising your hand, so unmuting yourself, show your video at the end of the presentation, and just raise your hand in the old honored fashion. And the third way of doing it is by actually raising your hand electronically in Zoom. The only other thing in terms of proceedings to mention is that this is a videoed, recorded event. So if you do not want to show your screen later on, then please don't do that. You can ask questions just by unmuting yourself. So I think that's all the admin out of the way. So it gives me great pleasure to once again welcome Professor Veronica Hope Hailey to the BLSI to give yet another talk on business. I think last time was trust in business. This is really a very much more up-to-date study around leadership throughout the pandemic. Now, Veronica used to be the Dean of the School of Management at the Bath University. She is the Emeritus Professor at the University of Bath now. She's a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences, and she's also a Fellow of the Business. And our association goes back a few years now. And as I said, it's the second time that Veronica is gracing us with her presence. Over to you, Veronica.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you, Andreas, for welcoming me back again. I can remember last year's guest lecture, Andreas, because I don't know whether anybody on this call was actually at last year's lecture, but as Andreas says, I was lecturing on trust and trustworthiness. And just before I got to the Institute, I was robbed at the Sainsbury's Cash Point in Kingsmead. And the update is, Andreas, that they actually caught the people. Good. So it's emblazoned upon my memory, the lecture at the Institute. But anyway, so welcome everybody. It's been an extraordinary year. And what I'm going to talk to you about this evening is one of the 6 reports that I've published in the last year. So I published 6 reports. 2 are mainly academic, but 4 are what we would call practitioner-based. They're based for business leaders, for the general public. And if any of you are interested in reading more, those links are at the bottom of my email, Andreas, and everybody is welcome to receive those links after this session. It's all publicly available material. So, but I'm mainly going to talk to you about a research report that I published in November. And this happened because I live up in Coombe Down. I was still working at the university as one of the university vice presidents. And I was staring out of my window, overlooking the back garden here, in just at the end of May, beginning of June. And I thought to myself, my goodness, what is going on in organisations at the moment is absolutely extraordinary. And that the leaders at the top of those organisations, mostly businesses I've looked at, but there were some public sector and charities, those leaders will be facing challenges that they've never faced before in their careers. And wouldn't it be amazing to try and capture live almost exactly what they were experiencing, the challenges that they faced, and capture that almost as a history of what they were facing as we went into the COVID crisis. So I'm lucky enough to have a long-standing partnership with a place called the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development. So I rang up its chief executive and I said, look, I'm not bothered about money or contracts or anything. I will set up a study to interview a group of senior leaders if you will publish the report. And I was lucky enough that Peter Cheese said, of course we will, Veronica. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about tonight. I interviewed 44 senior leaders, and by senior leaders, I mean they were either chief executives, chief finance officers, chief marketing officers, human resource directors. So they were either at board level, executive board level, or they were one layer below. And as I say, I interviewed 44 of them from 20 organisations. And then I did 2 focus groups with 16 human resource directors. And the period of time that I interviewed them over was between June and August 2020. One of the most extraordinary things about COVID was that normally if you're trying to interview and get access to people of that seniority, it's incredibly hard. It takes months. Their diaries are absolutely booked. They're usually flying around the world. As it was, it wasn't difficult to access them at all. They were very, very keen to tell their story. And in fact, when we got to 20 employers, we had to draw a line. We had many, many more that wanted to share their experiences with the research. But if we'd carried on collecting much more data, we'd never have got it published. And so in a way, this is their story. As I've said, 44 interviews. This is the name of the report. This is the link at the bottom there. For those of you that want to access that, you're most welcome. It's quite a long report and it goes into many, many different things. And I'm just going to give you some of the headlines, topics that came through. And I hope that in the Q&A, you can ask a little bit more about particular topics or particular areas that interest you. It was also, this report was also written up by the Financial Times in its December review of what business learnt in the time of coronavirus. So it was covered in that extended report, and the actual report is embedded into that article as well. And again, Andreas can let you have the link to that Financial Times article. So what was I looking at? Well, those of you who have heard me speak before will know that one of the areas I look at is trust and trustworthiness. And of course, the link between trust and COVID and responsible business is the idea that if you feel responsible to people, whoever those people are, whether they be customers, employees, shareholders, communities, government, if you feel responsible towards them and you show that responsibility, they in turn will give you the gift of their trust. They will trust you. And we know that a feature of trust is that if you trust somebody, you're much more willing to make yourself feel vulnerable and to be willing to take risks. And boy, was that necessary in COVID. That actually, you know, whether or not you were trusted as a business, as an employer, as a provider of services, as a seller of goods, I mean, whether or not you were trusted became huge. Could you get your employees, if you asked them to go into the workplace to provide services to customers, whether that be public services, whether it be banks, whether it be pharmacies, whether it be food retailers. You know, some of these leaders were having to ask their employees to take risks. And equally, they had to assure their customers, if you were going into that food retailer, that the customers could trust them and trust them to make the workplace or the supermarket safe. So trust and responsibility became incredibly important in this crisis. And we know through all the research that's been done well before COVID is that from a leader's point of view, inside an organization, if you have got high levels of trust, you will get faster decision making, more information sharing, more problem solving, a greater commitment to change. And of course, that was going on, rapid change going on across all organizations. You'll get much higher levels of engagement, and also you'll get greater innovation. And boy, have we needed innovation over these last 12 months. And my good friend and colleague, Margaret Heffernan, sums it up pretty well when she says, everything is easier with trust, and its absence makes everything harder. So if you went into this crisis with high levels of trust between you and your customers, between you and your shareholders, your investors, between you and your employees, between you and your trade unions, between you and your communities, everything was going to be easier for you. But the other risk, the other source of jeopardy for you as a leader was this. There's this old Dutch proverb that trust comes on foot and leaves on horseback. So one of the dangers in a crisis is that, and you saw a few organisations fall by the wayside in this way, Victoria Beckham, trying to furlough staff, you know, really, really lambasted over that, that trust leaves on horseback. You can lose it in an instant. So you could have gone into the crisis with high levels of trust, but if the way that you managed or led actually was seen to be untrustworthy, you lose it instantly. The other first half of this proverb is also really important in a crisis. So trust comes on foot. To gift somebody with your trusts, to give trust, you know, to deem somebody trustworthy is a gift. And it's a gift that you decide to give someone because you've really thought about it. It's not something that you decide very quickly. And so it's extremely difficult if you've got very, very low levels of trust to actually build those up in a crisis. Now, these are the various organisations that I looked at. As I say, we had people falling over themselves to take part. You'll see some public sector organisations there. You'll see some famous names like Santander, Microsoft. You'll see some Bath names as well, BMT, Arup over in Bristol, Borough Happold, of course, on the Bristol Road, and some not in Bath but very close by, important to the southwest, EDF at Hinkley Point. We had Handelsbanken nationwide over in Swindon, so a range of organisations. We had Dassault Systems, which is another French technology firm. And so these were the organisations from which we drew the 44 interviews with individual people. And what questions was I really trying to answer? Well, you know, what did they see as their major leadership challenges? How did these leaders steer their business through this crisis whilst honouring a commitment to being responsible and maintaining trust? How did they feel and think during this? What was it like being a senior leader? I mean, I've been a senior leader myself, and, you know, everybody faces dilemmas, and when you're in a crisis, it's an extremely difficult situation. So how did they feel and think? What was it like actually trying to lead through COVID? and what guided them through this time. So those were the questions, if you like, in general to them. And to myself, I was asking myself, well, how can I best capture this? How can I best capture this and show this moment in time? And the reports try to do that. So the reports are full of quotes from these amazing people. They really inspired me. At points I was in tears in the interviews. I've interviewed senior leaders now for 34 years. I've never cried in interviews. And I cried in a few interviews because some of the stories they told about how they were trying to keep businesses or workplaces open, stories about pharmacies, trying to keep pharmacies open and having their pharmacy windows egged by people, and, you know, low-paid pharmacy workers coming in to find, you know, that their pharmacies sort of messed up by angry people. The charities, the Salvation Army, I also interviewed. Those interviews were moving, absolutely moving. You know, leaders knowing that, you know, they're failing to get protective equipment for their employees, and their employees are bringing in marigold gloves from under the kitchen sink to try and protect themselves as they care for some of the most vulnerable people in society. I mean, some of these stories are really quite moving, and they are in the report, and I will try and do justice to them tonight, but I you know, implore you to read this report. What were the leadership challenges? What did they say it was like? Well, first of all, I mean, it's pretty obvious, but it's worth repeating because it is a year on and we've got used to this a little bit now. But of course, when COVID really dug in, these senior leaders who are used to lengthy data-driven reports told me there was no data, but they had to take decisions very, very fast. And one of them called it like leading in a fog. You know, that there's no data and we don't know where we're going and we don't know where this is going to end. We don't know whether it's going to end in a month, in 3 months, in 6 months, in 2 years. And so that high level of uncertainty also caused an enormous amount of shock within themselves. So not only were they trying to respond to the very high levels of anxiety and fear in their workforces, in their customers, in the communities in which they were based, but they also had their own levels of anxiety and fear. Very, very quickly, I think, and with this, you didn't have to be a business leader to realize this, we all suddenly realized the depth of what we would call the ecosystem in which we operate. Small businesses depend on big businesses. Big businesses depend on small businesses because they're in a supply chain. Hospitals depend on businesses because businesses like Microsoft provide so many of the systems there. Schools and universities also depend on business. Food retailers depend on other businesses. You know, we're all connected in this. And multiple stakeholders needing these leaders' protection. So, you know, I've mentioned a few: employers, suppliers, customers, health services, communities, shareholders, government, education. So a massive amount of people needing their support. They quickly realized they had to empower local managers to take decisions. So the smart ones realized that they couldn't keep centralizing everything and then, you know, just taking the decisions themselves, that things needed to move faster. So they had to decentralize very, very quickly and trust their local managers. At the same time, they had to take tough decisions about how to maintain the financial sustainability of these businesses. You know, what services were they going to keep open? What services might have to close? Were they going to furlough employees or not? And large numbers of the businesses I interviewed decided not to furlough. They felt it was unfair. They felt it was morally wrong, particularly if they were in receipt of government contracts, that everybody in receipt of a government contract did not furlough because they felt that that was morally wrong to take government money when they were already receiving government money for contracts. They were also aware of the enormous inequality of risk within their workforces. This has been talked about a lot, the hybrid workforces. We've got obsessed with everybody working from home. Let's just not forget those that weren't given the choice. There were plenty of people in workforces who were asked to go back into the front line. Transport, the emergency services, banks staying open, supermarkets, food retailers, pharmacies, as I've already said. There were a lot of people who had to keep employees on the front line. And as people said, you know, we are not all in this together. Rapid technological transition and, you know, how we're operating tonight is just one example of this. You know, a year ago, we're face-to-face in Queen Square. A year later, we're doing this as though it's completely normal life as it is now. And at the same time, permeating this were, you know, the enormous awareness of the social inequalities that COVID has writ large across our society. And Black Lives Matter was just one of those movements that came and hit these senior teams. And this is one of the CEOs talking about his reaction to Black Lives Matter, a very honest reaction, I think. It caught me unawares. I hadn't appreciated the emotions it had stirred up. I was out of my depth. It has opened my eyes and changed my thinking. So it wasn't just COVID, but it was all the other social movements that were going on. So to try and understand what they did in order to maintain trust during this time, I used one of the trust frameworks that's available in the academic literature, which was developed originally by Mayer in 1995, but was extended in 2005 by Graham Dietz and Deanne Den Hartog, a Dutch academic. And they understand that people's choices of whether to trust or not are based on four main factors. Firstly, does somebody see an individual or an organization as able? So in COVID, at the start of COVID, you know, did people see these senior leaders as able and competent? And there was a lot of question last year about the ability and competence of people to lead across all sectors. Secondly, did they see them as benevolent? What was it that they were doing that showed that they were not entirely self-interested, but they were bothered about others? And that's benevolence. Thirdly, did they have an integrity to them? Was there a moral code that was obvious to those different stakeholders and which was approved of by those stakeholders? And did they stick to that moral code? And lastly, fourthly, could people see those three things on a predictable, consistent basis? So could they believe that there would be a consistency that they could rely on through this crisis? So let's have a look how they fared against those four things, shall we? And I've sort of mapped what they did against those four things. So ability, how did they demonstrate their ability? Well, first of all, those that were really able, as I said earlier, realized that actually this was about making judgments. You had to make judgments, you had to make fast judgments, and you had to learn whilst you were working. So you couldn't commission a report, ask somebody to go away, try and find out how we should respond to COVID, bring it back to me in 3 months. That wasn't going to work. They would have to make judgment calls without data, and they would have to learn whilst working and leading at the same time. And this is one of the quotes from one of the CEOs. You need judgment as well as data. You'll get things wrong, and you have to decide to move on rather than waiting for the perfect set of data. And there's no data where we're going to. The other thing is that they had to learn to work as a team, because in order to learn, they had to get absolutely everybody's input. No one person had the answer. No one person had the perfect set of knowledge. No one had been there before. So what they had to do was learn to work as a team. And again, from another CEO, this can't be about lone leadership. So team working became very important. But it wasn't just team working in the boardroom. It was team working across the organisation. And they had to ensure very, very rapid two-way communication from the bottom of the organisation, from the local bank manager, very, very quickly telling the CEO of Santander what was going on in these different branches. So you had this very, very rapid communication, which was facilitated by Teams and Zoom and the technology. Thank goodness we had this technology, because actually communication just speeded up, got more intense, more people got access to the senior team, but they really needed that technology in order to take this intelligence in and learn. And we had these rapid technological transitions. I've already talked about that. And people had to take tough decisions. So one of the quotes here, you can't just shut the business to protect employees. You still need to serve customers. You just choose which services you can or cannot do. So, you know, for some businesses, they couldn't just close the business. So again, I use the example of pharmacies. Pharmacies were not allowed to close. The GP surgeries were allowed to close, but the pharmacies were not. The pharmacists were told to stay open. And at that point, you're then asking your workforce to go in to these pharmacies. And those were some of the tough decisions they had to make. In terms of benevolence, what they were doing was protecting and supporting. So ensuring the safety and sustainability of their employees and customers. But it wasn't just that, it was the whole of this ecosystem. So this is a managing director. The first quote is actually a managing director from BAE Systems. You absolutely have to put first and foremost the employees number one. That starts to build a whole new level of trust. But you've got customers, the supply chain, the small businesses that supply big business, the community, and I would add the shareholders as well. It's a broad spectrum of responsibility. So for instance, you know, BAE then said to its shareholders, we will not pay the dividend that we are due to pay in April. We will defer payment of the dividend, even though they had recorded very, very good results for the previous year. They said to the shareholders, sorry, the right thing to do is to defer paying you the dividend. What we are going to do instead is lean in to our suppliers, the smaller businesses that are struggling at this time, and try and prop them up financially. And so BAE was taking decisions to pay suppliers early, before contracts were finished, in order to ensure those businesses would stay afloat. Microsoft decided 3 priorities. It was going to prioritize education and schools and providing online services there, and skills. It was going to prioritize helping the health services, and it was going to prioritize helping the food producers and food retailers. So all of them were having to make a decision about how do we support everybody around us. This is another CEO. By the end of March, we knew we needed to get ready. Our priorities was to save as many jobs as possible and protect families and livelihoods. And from all of this, a new kind of leadership emerged, a much more humane, concerned and empathetic set of leaders. It was almost as though the invisible nature of these leaders, the humanity of them, suddenly was made visible through their concern, and also through people seeing them on Zoom and Teams. Suddenly people saw people in their homes and realised that these chief executives had cats and dogs and kids that sat on their knee when they were bored, and there was no school for the kids to go to. At the same time, they had this very difficult thing of how to balance out reward and risk. So who was going to take pay cuts? Most people froze bonuses, and they tried to instead freeze the bonuses that were paid to the normal set of people and actually prioritise those that were on the front line. And through all of this, they didn't have data, so how did they take a decision? Well, a lot of them talked about their existing cultures, and obviously all these people self-identified as responsible businesses in taking part in this research. So you can see the quotes here: the culture is strong and it's just feeling what the right thing to do. When I asked them, well, how did you make these decisions? I want to say that it was quite easy, because you use your values to guide your actions. Or I think this is a chief finance officer. It felt like the right thing to do. So if they had a pre-existing statement about what a responsible business was about, this became a kind of North Star. Joe Garner, who's the chief executive of Nationwide, said to me, well, Veronica, I can't control what's happening with Brexit or COVID, but I can control how Nationwide will respond to this. So I can use our values to make decisions about how we will respond. And also a number of them showed their integrity very, very, I think, profoundly, by not trivializing social issues. So when Black Lives Matter happened, a number of these leaders said, we were not going to give an instant response, because it was such a serious issue that if we just responded within an hour or 3 hours or 4 hours with some kind of press release, that meant we hadn't even thought about it. We hadn't really thought about these things. And you saw the integrity of senior leaders who took the time to reflect on really difficult issues. And lastly, the consistency came very simply from two things. One was the strength of the senior team and staying together as a team and being accessible and visible to the rest of the organisation, and also their values. So what's next? And we're far from out of this crisis. The crisis will persist. I wrote this in the report in November, when many people thought we were going to be out of this. Not at all. We've had a health crisis. We're now going into an economic crisis, which will become a social crisis as structural inequalities in society become more apparent. As one human resource director said to me, a lot of things have been hidden, bubbling under and getting worse. Workforces are traumatised, and the BT chief medical officer said to me that it's his belief that actually the trauma will come out as a form of delay, that we've got through this first year, but actually the mental health problems in particular will start to grow and grow. We've got this issue of ongoing hybrid working, and I think there will be resentment that will come through eventually between the splits between workforces, those who have been able to stay at home safe. Okay, it's got its own challenges working from home, I get that. But, there have been a lot of people who haven't had that opportunity to stay at home. And I think a lot of leaders felt that actually we've been trading off historic goodwill. We've been trading off the equity, as this managing director said, that we went into the crisis in with people's hearts and goodwill. And the other thing that a lot of people are not talking about, but I could tell you is absolutely true, is the majority of these people told me they were very, very, very tired. So in summary, and then I'll bring it to an end, what are the sort of, lamp bulb moments, the headlights, the headline things? Well, firstly, on leaders and leading, I think the invisible became visible. Leaders were suddenly accessible in a way that had not happened recently. This access through Zoom and Teams. One chief executive who employs 3,500 people told me he'd managed to speak to every single employee during 2020. I mean, that would never normally happen, and he'd done it via Zoom. I think people saw that CEOs are human too, and they saw that these people that they'd previously often experienced as quite aloof or quite distant had this humane, compassionate and empathetic side. We've seen how people lead through uncertainty. and use their judgment and their wisdom. And their integrity has come to the fore. And these leaders have learned to learn whilst working and become very, very reliant on others for intelligence and knowledge flows within the organisation and outside the organisation, really, really tapping into their networks. I think a new challenge for them going forward will be leading through grief and anger. And I think there's a lot that we have to be bothered about with the young. There's been a lot of focus on the old, and that's right. I come into an age group that people might categorise as old. And we've been, there's been a lot of attention on protecting us. But the young people have taken a heck of a bash as well. And I think business leaders are going to have to think about how we redress the balance with the young. Secondly, I think there's been this interconnectedness. We are all in the same storm. People realising that we're all part of one society and society is connected one with another. That interconnectedness, we've been enabled in that by technology. It's been a saviour, but it's also an oppressor. And we've got these examples of incredibly long days in front of the screen. This will be one for me, actually. Quite a long day in front of the screen. Relying much more on the local. And we also, the leaders talked to me about what they saw as pop-up leadership. They discovered people that they didn't know were leaders, suddenly revealing themselves in these workplaces to be the most amazing leaders in a crisis, pop-up leaders. And, they've said to me, we're making a commitment. We're not going to lose sight of those people. But two new challenges. Yes, people can be trusted to work from home, but will there need to be a return to the workplace, not permanently, not full time, but for certain amounts of social interaction to rebuild the trust amongst workforces, amongst teams and employees? Can you build trust in a virtual environment? And of course, how will we deal with the economic recession and interconnectedness? 2020 was wonderful. People lent out and helped everybody within their communities and their systems. But when you're facing a recession, maybe job cuts, how is this interconnectedness going to last? Will we still all feel we're in this together? And in fact, were we ever all in this together? This is a quote from the BT Chief Medical Officer. We're all in the same storm, but we're in very different boats, and some are more robust than others. So these social inequalities have been laid bare. The inequality of risk versus reward. So some people have taken greater risk, and very often they're the ones that are paid the least. And working from home is not an option for some because their homes have been revealed to be unsafe or unsuitable to work from. And the new challenge going forward is going to be health being on the business agenda for these leaders for the foreseeable future: physical, mental, organisational and societal. And with that, I'll stop there and hand over to Andreas. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much indeed, Veronica. That's been a really excellent update. And maybe we could all unmute ourselves very briefly just to give Veronica a round of applause.
Oh, no, don't, honestly.
No, I think that was excellent. I think it's very good. And I think we don't do that enough on Zoom. We just take it for granted.
That's true.
That applause is not easy on Zoom. But just because it's not easy doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. So thank you very much, Veronica. Very interesting study with leadership and actually very different to what I thought it was going to be, which is really quite interesting in terms of how people have reevaluated their own leadership.
Absolutely. It's an extraordinary year, Andreas, really extraordinary. And the key question now is, can we maintain this, some of these good things through into this next stage?
No, absolutely. And I think it's really interesting because obviously it's a bit like the wartime spirit, isn't it? We're all in it together, and even the government is using the very similar language. no, we have to fight the virus, and we have to do this. So I think it's brought people together. But it would be interesting to see whether that will sort of continue into the future. Right. Well, I've been trying to seed some questions in the chat room. I know that some people have already unmuted themselves and showing their screen. So does anybody want to ask a question themselves before I start reading out some of the question in the chat room? Phil, you've raised your hand. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
I can, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Professor. Excellent. If I follow on from your point, I think you and Andreas have just made, a lot of the things you were talking about, like obviously the trust issue and authentic leadership, I think came out. And teamwork and communications, all these sorts of things, it seems to me, are those that you would find in any management textbook about best practice of how to be a manager and a leader. And as you say, you both said, the important thing is how do managers, now they've sort of realized there's great value in actually reading the textbook and doing what they should be doing. How does that going to be maintained? And if it's not, what will that do to trust within an organization?
That's a great question, Phil. And it is a key question, because let me unpack that. Over the last 10 years since the global financial crisis, lots of people said we've got the wrong sort of leaders, all right? We've got the wrong leaders. Now, one of the extraordinary things is these are the leaders at the beginning of COVID, all right? So what we've shown is that these leaders can do this, okay? It's not that they can't be empathetic, compassionate, very, very human, very authentic, to use your word. They can do it. And then you're absolutely right. The second thing is that if they now retreat, that I predict, I think absolutely, it's a brilliant question, Phil. And I have said this to them. If you now retreat, there will be even more cynicism about this than before. Because in effect, you've pulled the rabbit out of the hat. You've shown that you can do this. So what is it that's stopping you doing this all the time? It's a great question. Now, my answer is, so I agree with you with your, the dangers here and the risk is huge. My answer is that I think we've also got to support them. So Margaret Heffernan and I are starting 4 very, very senior chief executives and board directors an initiative called the Healthy Work Project, where we are going to try and support people and get a group of these senior leaders together who do not want to retreat to support each other. Because the difficulty is, Phil, that there will be, if you like, the mercenary, the hard, who will or have never had any intention of being empathetic and compassionate. And, if there are difficult decisions to be taken, those sort of people will take them. And if you're in competition with that person, keeping your integrity, your compassion is going to be a hard number. I said to some MBA students the other week that I was lecturing, I said, in 2021, we've got to be really careful. Oh, hello, Nina. Sorry. Hello, Nina. So I said to the exec MBA students, Nina, at the school, I said, we've got to be really, really careful who we judge over this next year. Don't judge the ones that are trying to be different and perhaps making the odd mistake. Try and choose the people that you're going to be judgmental about very, very carefully. And maybe if they really are, those that are really trying to be different, they will make mistakes, Phil, and they will get things wrong. And then the question for us is, how do we react? And I think we've got to encourage the people that are trying to be different from this. Otherwise, everybody will just retreat and go, well, that was just a blip, which is what happened with the financial crisis. They just went,
No, very good.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Nina has already got her hand up. So Nina, please ask your question.
Make it easy, Nina. Hi, Nina. Make
somehow
it easy.
I spontaneously ended up in this great event, and unfortunately I had problems signing up, so I only heard the last 10 minutes, which were amazing. Thank you so much. I don't know if you know, and if you have advice for a new leader who had to change countries in lockdown and take over a new team. So I started a role as a chair in Germany in June. I don't know if you even noticed. And do you have any advice? Again, so I find teaching leadership much easier than actually doing it yourself. And perhaps any advice in these special times, how to manage a team you actually mainly know virtually? Because a lot of people say the people I already knew, it's not a problem to interact online, but if you don't know each other that well, it can be tricky.
I think it can be tricky. Nina and I don't have any research on it, but what I do know, Nina, is that firstly, I'm working with a whole bunch of teams, Nina, and I looked at somebody the other day and I said to this woman, Jenny, at the CIPD, and we've been working together now since last June. And I went, Jenny, you and I have actually never met, have we? Oh. She went, no, we haven't. And I feel as though actually I have quite a good relationship with her. But what I think we have done is, and I think somebody, Andreas has just said this when everybody just did a bit of a spontaneous clap. I think the danger is on Zoom or Teams or whatever you're using, Nina, is that it's all very tasky. The meeting starts at 12, we start. And somehow I think you've got to allow some time for social interaction. But the thing I have noticed with social time on Zoom or virtually, it doesn't really matter, you just can't do it in big numbers. It's too much. So if you are going to do some social time, my advice to you would be to do it with groups 2, 3, 4 people, because to actually interact informally with more than that virtually is impossible, I think. But I think it is possible. I really do. But email me afterwards, Nina. You know where I am.
Yeah. No, good. No, thank you for that. It reminds me. It went viral. A council meeting.
Oh yeah.
Council meeting went viral, and that was a good example how Zoom meetings can go completely AWOL, completely wrong. And if you want to have a look what not to do on Zoom, if you haven't seen it, just Google Zoom Parish Council meeting. Yeah. You'll come across it. Duncan, you've had your hand up electronically and physically. So do you want to ask you?
Yeah, Veronica, I just wanted to ask about what's happening in mental health trusts. They tend to use the McKinsey model of what's known as cultural influence, which is that they introduce innovations and they expect people to conform to them, and then create a situation in which they become outsiders unless they conform. Now, complaints have been received by professional bodies that staff are leaving mental health posts because they are being forced to adapt to too great a burden of change. Yet one of your findings is that innovation is non-negotiable. Does this mean that they're going to continue to stream out?
Is this, Duncan, were these reports relating to the last year of COVID, or was this just generally?
I'm seeing from board minutes of January of this year.
Of this year.
So, having major problems of being able to retain staff.
Well, I'm not surprised. I mean, the mental health services in this country have been underfunded and under pressure without COVID, and COVID will have put them under even more pressure. I don't know I haven't researched the mental health trusts, so I have no data. And secondly, I don't know the McKinsey model that you're talking about. But I mean, I think behind your question, Duncan, is the idea that you can dress something up as innovation, which is in fact compulsory, if that makes sense. It's just an imposed change, which is called innovation. I can understand what you're saying. I think management and businesses can use vocabulary loosely and to their own ends, but I cannot comment on the actual mental health scenario, except that we all know that it's underfunded and it will need more funding over the next few years because of the impact of COVID, in my opinion.
Okay, thank you
very
for that.
much.
Good. We've got Alex Palmer in the chat room. Alex, do you want to ask the question yourself, or do you want me to read it out? You can unmute yourself and ask it yourself if you want.
Hi, Veronica. Yeah, sure. I'll read it out. So I just really enjoyed hearing what you had to say. And when you're saying about the leading in a fog, it certainly reminded me of the Kniffin model, which I don't know if you're familiar with, but sort of decision making in challenging times. And it's about moving through from sort of chaos where you should act first, then sense to see if there are any changes, and then probe to see how you could do it better. So that was certainly what seemed to be what you were saying in terms of there's no time to instigate sort of reporting and to sort of come back and say what you should do after that, because you just needed to act and do something straight away. Which then moves you through into, hopefully you do that, you act, and it gets better, and therefore you move it into the complex space, and then you can do different things with that. With that model in mind, what do you think out of those 4 pillars that you were sort of testing with the conversations you were having with the business leaders, which do you see are the most important? I mean, I can assume that you need to be looking at all sort of integrity and benevolence and agility all at once, but did you find that some were coming out as more important as others as an initial first step in that sort of chaotic world?
That's a brilliant question, Alex. That's a great question. I think well, it's difficult. I'm thinking about the question. I'm thinking they couldn't just be benevolent at the beginning. They couldn't just say good things. They had to be benevolent, but they had to also be able. I mean, one of the things that struck me at the time was you could be benevolent and very, very kind, but unless that was actually matched with a level of competence, that benevolence could put people at risk. Does that make sense? Or it could put the business at risk. So you could be, I mean, the chap that was saying you have to take some really tough decisions and some services can't close, which means you're going to have some employees in the workplace. In effect, what he was doing was saying, answering the question that you're talking about here, Alex, which is, well, to be completely benevolent, you would actually just say no employees go into the workplace. But actually, if your workplace is providing an essential service of some kind, you're going to have that benevolence matched with a ability and competence to actually keep that blooming workplace open because of the service it provides. Does that make sense? So it's and then the way that you take that decision, I think, has to be with a certain amount of integrity underpinning that decision. But I suspect if you pushed me, Alex, I'd probably say in those very early moments, it was getting that benevolence matched with some competence, because they had to make decisions financially as well. They couldn't take decisions that would then eventually mean the business went bust, because then nobody's benefiting. Customers, employees, communities, nobody's going to benefit if the business goes bust. So I would put
those don't form the ability is a sense of benevolence in making sure that there's that balance there for the longer term.
And I think, if you don't mind me, Alex, saying, I think the reason that your question's also really interesting is it also relates to Duncan's question around innovation, because if we want some of the innovation that they showed in leadership to actually be sustained and maintained for the future, there's certain bits that any of us find good. If we want that to be sustained, we're going to have to be benevolent to them over this next year as they try and experiment and innovate. Because the one thing we know about innovation is that things will go wrong and they'll make mistakes and they'll fail. And actually, some of the questions for us as followers, if you like, is how benevolent are we going to be to leaders to allow them to innovate? Or are we going to sit here like sort of judgmental, holier than thou people, and when they make a mistake, judge them terribly so that they'll never experiment or innovate again? So it's a really interesting question for us as well. How benevolent are we going to be towards these business leaders? Great question. Great question.
Excellent. Yeah, and I think that just for everybody's benefit, the Cynefin framework, which was initiated by Professor Dave Snowden, is a really interesting concept in terms of how to deal with different situations and show leadership in particular. I think I would recommend it for people to have a look at Dave Snowden's Cynefin framework, because clearly at the beginning of the pandemic, it was all very chaotic and you had to make decisions on the hoof, whereas it then became extremely complex, and this continues to be very complex. The two things it hasn't been is obvious and complicated. It's much more complex than and chaotic. So I think I would sort of plug Dave Snowden's model as something to consider when evaluating this. Trevor, are you looking to ask a question? I saw your hand up earlier.
I am looking to ask a question, yes.
Hello, Trevor.
Hello, Veronica. I remember your presentation from last time at BRLSL, and you like to move around a lot when you make a presentation. So I think today must have been a little bit more difficult for you to remain static.
Well, that's very kind. Well, I kind of, like most things, Trevor, I've learned to do it over the last year. But I've learned to just stay in front of this laptop screen, but well observed.
My question is, though, that trust is a two-way thing, of course, between the person who's being led and the person who's leading. Did you get any impression, or do you think it was easier in this crisis situation that people were more willing to be led and therefore more willing to give trust? And that then goes on, of course, to the future, which we've been talking about, be able to maintain this. When we get through this, will we ever get back to a normal? We don't know. But when we get through more of this, will people go back to their old cynical themselves and not be so willing to give their trust, and therefore more difficult to lead and to generate that trust?
Well, again, I applaud all of you for these questions, because they're just great questions. So I think people were more willing to trust because, in a way, Trevor, they had to, because we were all vulnerable. And the more vulnerable we feel, actually, there is a propensity to need to trust. It suddenly doesn't become, shall I, shan't I? It's actually, well, I really, really need to. So I think that helped in the initial stages. I think I go back to, it wasn't Alex, it was Phil's question. I think the issue will be maintaining that trust. For me, I personally think will depend on these leaders keeping some of those golden threads of compassion and empathy and seeing their businesses as rooted in a community environment, not unanchored things floating around in a global environment. So I think there will be certain things that people will expect of businesses now. And if they don't deliver on them, then I repeat what I said in a way to Phil. I think the fall of the if you like, the decline of trust could be quite rapid, because they've seen they can do it. Does that make sense? They've seen that business can be different. So in a way, the opportunity, they've raised expectations which could now be dashed. Right. So I think it's a great question. The other thing that I've wondered, Trevor, is at times it's reminded me of the end of the Second World War, where, of course, people came back from the war and they were unwilling to accept the old social order. They were not, I mean, and certainly in the UK, they voted in a socialist government and they chucked Churchill out. And they said, you know, we are going to expect more from the state. We want more equality of opportunity and access. And I do wonder whether we will see social movements just saying that this disparity of wealth and the inequality is no longer acceptable to them because people have taken too much risk. I don't know. I'm a historian originally, and I just find it very interesting that I wonder whether there'll be the same levels of anger and grief combined that might cause people to call for social change.
Well, the comparison is very worthwhile because they threw out the very person that they trusted to take them through the crisis. Yep.
So I don't know. I mean, obviously, I don't know. I'm hypothesizing, but.
Yeah, but it's a good hypothesis. So
I don't know.
Thank you for that. And Karen, you've raised your hand electronically. So would you like to ask your question, please?
Yeah, I would. Thank you. Thank you, Veronica. I really enjoyed your talk and your study. I also do leadership work in the public and voluntary sector. So I am the chair of a charity. And I was a HR director and a training director of a large UK-wide mental health organization. So my leadership experience has been of the sort you describe. And I've watched in the charity that I chair, which is in Baines, how wonderfully applying a model of leadership or a way of leading which supports people, respects them hugely, flattens hierarchy, and involves them in decision-making. So, and we kept going. So we didn't miss a beat during the lockdown. And I watched that same people really stepping up to the plate, some people having, so no one was punished for needing to be out. So there were people with vulnerable health members, family members with vulnerable health and so on. I did a talk last summer around some of the issues, and I looked at leadership in extremists, so some of the military stuff, which I thought really interesting. And what I found interesting about it, that how it chimed, was the first that people first had to be capable. So if they and that the trust had to be there, and the leader had to muck in, so they had to kind of be alongside. And I feel so passionately about this, as I hear you do, and I hear the questions all point to this, that in effect we need to change the way we do things desperately. And I'm looking now, because I've just done a little study about the effects on children and young people for another context, and it's so dire. Yeah. And it's so unequal. And you know, even with and as you said, you know, the mental health services just aren't there. I mean, they've always rather been light on the ground anyway. But it's how do we persuade? And I take your point about people stepping up, but changing cultures or allowing the humanity of people to come to the fore. And I guess I would add this other notion of friendly and firm. So I really believe, as a psychotherapist, that you really need to be, need to contain people's anxiety. Yeah. And that bit of trust comes from your ability to say, it's going to be okay. We're going to manage this somehow.
Yeah.
You need to kind of believe that. So you're believing in them, and mistakes just aren't the problem. Mistakes will happen.
Absolutely.
It's what you do after. Anyway, thank you. I just wanted to put some of that in there. And I think I really was impressed with the military, the studies of in war, and that if you build this trust, then people will go along with you. And that, that the trust and the coming clean if things don't work out, so you can,
absolutely,
that it's okay to but it's really important to apologize.
Well, can I make 3 comments on that? Because there's 3 things I'd love to comment on. One is, one of the things that Margaret and I are hoping to do with this Healthy Work project is link these CEOs and these senior directors with young people. And let them hear what it's been like for young people, and how how they need to think about how they're crafting a future that is inclusive for these young people, many of whom feel they've missed education, or they've missed job opportunities, they've missed apprenticeships, and what responsibility these people feel. So that's one thing. The second thing, that my husband works in international aid, and when I first started doing this these interviews, and I talked to John about it, and he was interesting because, drawing on the military analogy here, he said that, of course, if you're in an emergency situation in an aid organization, and that might well involve the military or the NGOs or whatever, those people that put up an emergency refugee camp in 3 months and get the medical services and the food services going, both the military and the NGO sector would recognize that these people would then, the leaders at that point, would be exhausted, and they would be flown back, given literally rest and relaxation, and restored before they would either come back or go on another mission. And I think one of the things that's worried me as well is that these leaders are very, very tired. And yet there appears to be, and if you're a psychotherapist, you will understand that, there appears to be no place for respite. I mean, many of them were saying that over the Christmas break, it was the first 2 weeks that they'd had off since March. Some of them have been dealing with COVID in their families and all of this stuff. We've got some really, really tired people as well leading here. And that's quite a risk for them, for everybody else. And I don't know how we factor that in, because there's also that thing that you're supposed to keep going. That actually, if you're a proper leader, then you're there for everybody, but they are very, very tired, Karen. They're very, in themselves, quite worn out. So that's a second comment, and I can't remember what my third comment was, so I'm sorry.
Well, I think I would say about that I think your idea of bringing them together, because there's energy in that. So I set up a mentoring for it was the leaders of early years provision. So it was a national professional qualification. So I did the mentoring component of that. And it was a 1-to-1 mentoring for each leader. So it took them out, it gave them time out. So it's that model of looking after the leaders so that they have the capacity to look after, but also to let go. And to trust. So if they built trust, then that's what needs to happen. The organization. So we've got now and I was just going to also say that if you're interested, Mentoring Plus is the organization that I chair. And
really?
And that the other bit to say about that is that we're part of business mentoring for young people. So we were part of a Bristol consortium. So if you're interested in seeing the leaders up, because that's energizing. And we get a lot of young leaders in Bath coming to mentor as a thing that's just not
brilliant
doing the business. But really, I think your idea of bringing them together and creating perhaps, also following on from what Andreas said about how you work on Zoom is small, breaking out in small groups, for example, or just working in small groups to supervise, if you like, co-mentor.
Yeah. Brilliant.
That was the model, that was the rollout model that we used. And it worked a treat because it's about relieving. But it's fundamentally, it's about letting go of thinking you're the one who has to do everything.
Exactly.
Well, I think that's the other thing that speaks to Trevor's point as well, because the other thing they discovered, which I tried to make, in the talk, is they discovered they had to let go. And then once you'd let go, you could trust everybody.
Exactly.
That actually everybody would do their work. They would be productive if they worked from home. I mean, that's why it's been so... Anyway, sorry, Andreas, I'm getting a little carried away.
Very good. It's good to see that Zoom has brought Karen and Veronica together. You go, it's a good contact for both of you. So that's excellent.
Thank you. Well, I'd love to make contact, Karen. Really would.
Hands are still going up. I just wondered, before I go to other people who've already asked you a question, Ian, you've unmuted yourselves. Do you want to ask a question?
Oh, yes, thank you. Thank you for very interesting talk, Veronica.
Thank you.
What you alluded to the point about there's going to be some tough things to do after this is all over. And one of the interesting things, I heard an American economist who said that this COVID thing might make us 20%, might make the economy 20% smaller and us all 20% worse off. And that's not a problem in itself, because if you go back 25 years, we were probably all 20% worse off. But the problem's going to be that some people are going to be a lot worse off, and some people, for instance, pensioners, might be a lot better off. So do many of these leaders realize that while it's been a very tough time through COVID, a lot of the really difficult decisions might be after it?
I think I could say that virtually everyone I spoke to, Ian, thought the worst was yet to come.
Yeah.
That actually the really difficult stuff was now going to start happening with the economic recession and the social inequalities. And I think, this then relates to again, what Trevor was talking about as well, that it's going to be extremely hard for them to carry on, for instance, I think, persisting with such enormous differentials in salary levels, between the lowest paid and the top teams and things like that. And that's where I think they feel that there is going to have to be some levelling. I don't want to use Boris Johnson's phrase because he means it about the country, but somehow we have to close these gaps between those that are extremely well off before COVID, possibly could come out of COVID, as you're saying, even more well off, and those who potentially weren't very well off going into COVID are going to come out even worse. I think there's going to have to be a levelling. Now, either it will happen through government and through state intervention, or these leaders will have to do something about their reward and career schemes themselves. I don't know what they're going to do, Ian, but...
I see the problem with that is I don't think that our friends in private equity are going to want to join in.
No, I think you're probably right.
And I also think that, I used to live in the southeast. The people that I sold my house to for a large, over £1 million figure, I've got a huge mortgage, which is relying on a bank salary and services.
Yeah.
There's something's got to give someone.
Yeah.
Yes, well, but we also know, Ian, I don't know what's going to happen, but I think I'm going to leave it as saying, I think we are going to have some really difficult times. And whether this happens voluntarily, whether it happens through business coming together, or sectors coming together, or, government, I don't know, but I suspect somehow this will have to be addressed, despite people's mortgages.
Yeah. I wrote to our MP at the time when Mark Rashford was firing off about why was I getting a 2.5% increase in my pension when kids were going hungry. Yeah. I was on saying, we couldn't possibly not stick with triple lock.
Well, we've seen the reaction to the nurses' pay rise this week.
Okay,
we've seen that.
Yeah, we're going to move on because there's a few other people who want to ask you questions. One of whom is me. I haven't asked my question yet, and I want to be quite controversial, and actually saying that actually leadership probably hasn't actually been truly tested yet, because we've gone through a health crisis, which the government has actually supported quite heavily in terms of furloughing, in terms of financial support, etc., and has at some point employed more than 23 million people by doing that. So I agree with you, Veronica, that the worst is still to come, both initially economically, then socially, and then finally politically. But what do leaders need to do differently when we get to the economic crisis? Because that's when the rubber really hits the road. Once the financial support from the government is no longer there as a sort of crutch.
Well, I'm going to, I can't help bringing out historical stuff. So I don't know whether you've ever heard Margaret Macmillan speak. She's a historian. If you do ever hear her, she's Canadian. I think she's back in Canada. Oh, no, she was master of one of the Oxford colleges, St Anthony's, but she's Canadian. Anyway, she talks about the start of the First World War as a failure of imagination, Andreas, of a failure of people to imagine actually in that situation that really bad things can happen. I'm flipping it and saying what we need now is real imagination, real creativity to try and think that actually, how do you make something that is based on a different set of principles? Now, I'm going to say to you, I think it's really, really hard. And, you know, Margaret and I are going to try and do that with some of these leaders, really try and get them to imagine a different way of operating. Because equally, you could say this, Andreas, you could say this. Our obsession with shareholder value is approximately 30 to 35 years old. Yeah. I can remember somebody from Lloyds Bank coming into an MBA lecture in the early 90s and talking about the obsession with shareholder value to the exclusion of any other metric. Yeah. It's only 100 years, maybe 80 years since Rowntree's, Lever Brothers and Cadbury's saw it as their responsibility to provide housing, health and schools for their communities. It's not as though things can't be reinvented. It is possible to do things differently. Yep. I'm not sure that I'm the person with all the imagination, but as sure as heck I can support others that are cleverer than me and maybe have more imagination. And I think we've just got to be imaginative about these solutions. Yeah. That's all I'm saying. No, it's not always been thus.
Yeah. I just very much hope that we can unfreeze the current leadership practices and unfreeze them, change them and refreeze them quite quickly. I think that's...
Andreas, I agree. And if you look at the Financial Times article where they've interviewed me, that's what I talk about, because I say we're in a liminal moment. Karen will understand what I mean. Yeah. We're in a liminal moment. They're unfrozen. And unless we grab this moment, they will refreeze back into where they were. Yeah. So spot on, Andreas.
No, thank you for that. Duncan, you've got your hand up again. Would you like to?
Very briefly, I just wanted to ask an industry-related question, and that is an awful lot of the research that I think you were involved with, the CIPD, is that engagement and productivity tend to work against each other. However, it does look as if productivity, on one hand, as a drive, and engagement as a moral impulse need to work together.
Right.
What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I didn't know that engagement and productivity worked against each other, but I thought most of the productivity studies that have been done have actually shown that if you get high levels of employee engagement, it actually drives productivity, Duncan. Does it? Doesn't it?
No,
should do.
The research seems to be the opposite.
I think
if you're not going to accept the research, then my question is going to be rather differentiated.
I tell you, the Be the Business that I've only just got involved with is the national initiative on driving productivity, because we're actually not doing terribly well at it, Duncan. We're not actually the most productive nation in the world. But so it's only through my involvement with Be the Business that all the data appears to show that high levels of engagement drive productivity.
Yeah. Okay, Phil, we've got you maybe the final question then, Phil, because then we need to wrap it up. So you can.
Oh gosh, what an honour!
It's all down to you, Phil.
Let's make it a good one, Phil.
I'm going to do my best. It seems to me that the larger organisation, and your study was basically large organisations, might have a more complex ecosystem, but they have more degrees of freedom than firms in the small, medium sector. Do your findings, do you think, translate across to the smaller?
Brilliant question. How do you come up with them?
It's genius.
It's just genius. Phil, you're a genius. So
that's what we need, genius.
So if you read the report, one of the questions I ask at the end is this. Exactly. I say it's all very well to be a responsible business. If you're Microsoft, BAE, etc., all leaning into schools and hospitals and food retailers and everything else, when you're making the profits that you have and you've got the slack in the system, what does it mean to be responsible as a small to medium-sized enterprise? And are we putting smaller businesses under too much pressure?
Yeah.
Is responsible business actually a large business concept? I mean, you could be ethical as a small business, but can we really expect these small businesses, maybe startups, to provide the level of support that a great question, Phil. Okay. I have a paragraph on that in the end of the report.
Oh, well, I'll have to read the report. Thank you.
Well, no, it does sound as though you don't need to, actually.
But thank you very much for this genius question, Phil. And I think we'll keep it at that for today. But I'm going to circulate, because I think Veronica mentioned it at the beginning. I'm going to circulate the various links to the various...
Yes, please do.
To everyone on this call, but also to the BLSI Business and Economics group as a whole. So before I just tell you about what's coming up in the next couple of weeks, maybe we can all just unmute ourselves once again and just give Veronica another big round of applause.
Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed, Veronica. What's coming up next is in April. We have a talk by Dr. Anna Walker from Bath Spa University on business transformation and innovation. And then in May, we have a talk by Dr. Antonio Ravelli on lessons from family businesses. What can big business learn from small businesses, family businesses? That would be quite interesting. And then in June, we have Professor Pali Smart from Bristol University giving a talk on the importance of industrial sustainability. So those are the next 3 months. So I hope that will be engaging. Once again, Veronica, thank you very much for dedicating all this time and sharing a excellent report with us.
It's been a pleasure.
Yes.
Pleasure.
So I hope to see you all next month. And as I always say to people at this stage during the pandemic, stay healthy, stay safe, and most importantly of all, stay sane. Good night.
Good night.
Night.
Good night.
Thank you, Veronica.
Thank you, everybody.